Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And if you have any other video ideas, you can let me know in the comments also. And today we are going to talk about a area of northern Nebraska. We're talking about Keya Paha County, and in the 1880s and 1890s, this was a haven in this area for horse thieves and cattle rustlers. And we are going to tell a story, basically, or a few stories. And this is going to come out of a book, Bad Men and Bad Towns, by Wayne C. Lee. And he had done a lot of research and put a lot of things together in his book that tells stories of some events that kind of run in sequence. So this story or sequence of events happened in 1889. So Keya Paha County is called was called the Mob County in the 1880s and 1890s, and it was on the Niobrara River that forms the southern boundary of the county, and I believe the South Dakota state line forms the northern boundary of the county. And it does form some very deep canyons, and they run down to the river, and these formed avenues of escape for the fugitives from the law, and they would come into these canyons to escape the law. And Keya Paha County had more than its share of lawbreakers within this boundary, and most of them were from other areas. And I believe I've got another video on an area just east of here called Devil's Nest, Nebraska. I've been working on that one too, and I'm not sure what order I'm going to post the videos up, but Devil's Nest, Nebraska is just east of here, and a lot of outlaws used to hang out there too, and there's some stories for that area too. So very similar terrain, very treacherous, thick with brush, difficult to navigate, very good areas for these criminals to escape the law after they've done various things. And Wayne Lee even says, in this area, that Doc Middleton, among others, used these canyons on the north side of the Niobrara at times for his hideout. And Doc Middleton was a very famous horse thief and cattle rustler. So the law in Keya Paha County was unable to cope with this influx of horse thieves and cattle rustlers, and the citizens there felt they could do the job themselves if they were given the chance. So they formed a vigilance committee. And if you know anything about vigilance committees of the Old West, the vigilance committees were what came out of them was the vigilantes that would give people old frontier justice if the long arm of the law was unable to catch people. But these vigilance committees, if they were able to get a hold of these criminals, they might met out their own law. So people who owned a good horse or a good team of horses, they lived in dread that they would be stolen. And no matter how closely the owners watched their animals, they seemed to disappear as if by magic. So the only solution, or the way the settlers saw it, was to stop the trouble at the source. So they went after the thieves themselves. So they gathered any bit of information that they could find that pointed a suspicious finger at anyone who might be doing the stealing. And most of their information was reliable, but some, no doubt, was not. So some people who did little more than lend a helping hand to someone who seemed to be in need may have found themselves trying to explain to the vigilance committees that They were totally innocent of any implication of theft of horses or cattle or whatever the case happened to be. So, in the span of a couple of years, from 1889 to 1891, Keya Paha County really made a name for itself. But it earned the reputation of not being a hospitable place for horse thieves and cattle rustlers. So even neighbors began to look sharply at other neighbors and tried to, watch them, and everyone tried to walk a straight and narrow path so that the vigilantes would not suspect them of anything. So these vigilantes in Keya Paha County began to hit full stride in 1889, and horse thieves of the past few years were now by February of 1889 they were taking cattle instead of horses. But that was hitting the ranchers even harder than losing a few horses now and then. So small herds of cattle were starting to be driven off and sold to buyers who weren't too particular about the brands on the cattle. And the vigilantes, they were convinced that George Babcock was one of the leaders of these thieves, and they set out to let all the thieves in the county see what happened to their kind. So they heard that Babcock was in the county seat of Springview, Nebraska, and they went there to find him. So they surmised that he was probably staying at the Tremont Hotel, and they went there about midnight and asked the clerk on duty, who was Fred Burnham. They asked him if Babcock and another man on their list, C.M. Clay, were in. So Burnham told them that neither of them was in right then, and they were sure he was telling the truth, but it was learned later that they were actually at the hotel and they were well armed. So earlier that day, Sheriff Cobble had arrested a man that some suspected of being a rustler. He was posing as a cattle buyer, but he wasn't particular about the cattle he was buying. So some of the vigilantes felt that the buyer should be sure that the cattle he was buying were from the real owner and not just taking cattle that may be stolen. So they felt that Arthur Maupin was anything but careful about ownership, and that he might even be helping the rustlers in rounding up the cattle for sale. So Sheriff Cobble had suggested that he take his business someplace other than Keya Paha County. And Maupin ignored the request and was downright belligerent, and he was well armed. So it was while Arthur Maupin was eating dinner at the Tremont Hotel that the sheriff moved up behind him with a drawn gun and arrested him. So Maupin had no chance to fight back at that point. So there were too many unanswered questions about Maupin's activities that needed to be cleared up. So Maupin was anything but cooperative, so Sheriff Cobble took him to the courthouse and put him in the steel cage in the wooden jail building, and this was behind the courthouse. So the sheriff was hoping that a night in jail would loosen Maupin's tongue. So the sheriff wasn't even sure where Maupin came from. Some of them said he came from O'Neill, Nebraska. Some people said he came from Fort Pierre, South Dakota. And Maupin wouldn't really admit either. And that only increased the suspicions of the sheriff. So no telling where he would take the cattle that he was supposedly buying here in Keya Paha County. But the sheriff was only thinking of his own method of getting Maupin to talk. He hadn't taken into account that the vigilantes and their methods of dealing with suspicious characters. So with the vigilantes, it was reaching the point where suspicion was tantamount to conviction of guilt. So sometime during the latter part of the night, the vigilantes struck. They had failed to find George Babcock in town, but they knew where Maupin was, and they broke into the wooden jail and they riddled Maupin with bullets in the steel cage, and the coroner could only report that Maupin had come to his death at the hands of persons unknown. So the story continues on. Still 1889. John Newell, who was 34 and unmarried, he lived about 20 miles northeast of Springview, near the Keya Paha River. Nobody could accuse him of stealing either horses or cattle, but he was a generous man who was willing to share anything he had with anyone who needed it. And it was a habit that the vigilantes considered a fault. On several occasions, he had put passers-by up that asked for a night of lodging. And on a few of such nights, his visitors were men that the vigilantes were trying to capture. So it was known that the vigilantes considered Newell on the wrong side of the law when he allowed horse thieves and cattle rustlers to spend the night with him. So still, no one expected anything drastic to happen to the generous Mr. Newell. But on May 29th, 1889, friends came to his house and found him dead. So they had heard that vigilantes had been riding the night before, but hadn't expected them to come after Newell. Some reports say that Newell was killed in bed. Others say he was stretched out on the floor with his night clothes on. There were 24 bullets in his body, and there was also some buckshot. His own shotgun was laying between his legs with one barrel discharged, but it was impossible to suspect that this was a case of suicide. The door in the house was also battered down and windows were broken. So his crime had been harboring horse thieves and cattle rustlers. So we continue on in 1889. George Babcock, who's still at large, was still the prime target of vigilantes since earlier in the year. They had been after him since around February when they caught the man that they thought had bought the stolen cattle, A.J. Maupin, and that ended with Maupin's death, but Babcock was still out there. So evidently the vigilantes had expected to catch Babcock at Newell's place, but rumor had it that Newell had given shelter to Babcock, so John Newell had paid for his life for that situation, but Babcock was still free. So, not finding Babcock at Newell's, the vigilantes went to the next home that was on their list of a possible hiding place for George Babcock. And that place was the home of his brother-in-law, T.V. Smith. It was only a few miles from the Newell place. So they arrived at Smith's place at about 3 in the morning on May 30th. They surrounded the house. Here they decided on a different tactic. If Babcock was there, it could be dangerous to get too close to the door. They had several rolls of cloth with them, and then they soaked them in kerosene. They struck a match, they set the rolls on fire, and they quickly threw those fireballs through the windows of the Smith house, setting the interior of the house on fire. Then they waited, but not for very long. The fire was exploding into an inferno. Everyone inside rushed out into the yard in their night clothes. There was no time for making elaborate preparations to greet the visitors outside. George Babcock was one of the men who rushed out of the burning building. So the vigilantes swarmed over him, and as soon as they had him all tied up, and they put him on a horse, and they started for the river. The destination was obvious. There were trees down by the river with limbs big enough to hold up a swinging man. It seems apparent what happened, but there was a variety of reports on what actually did take place. So here are the 3 reports. The first report, and most likely, is that Babcock was hanged from a tree limb, although another report said that the vigilantes decided against hanging him, but kept him in custody, which was not very likely. A third story said that he jabbed his spurs into his horse and he escaped, but where did he get spurs, especially in the middle of the night when he would have had his night clothes on? So take your choice of what happened. So that is a few of the stories of Keya Paha County in the 1800s, which was said to be one of the horse thief and cattle rustler capitals of Nebraska, and how the vigilantes took control of their county back from the notorious outlaws that were preying on their county for some time. So like and subscribe if you like these kind of stories.